Welcome back to the Alts Podcast. I'm your host, Horacio Ruiz. We bring you industry leaders and creators to give their insights on the rapidly changing and exciting world of alternative assets. Opinions expressed on this podcast by the host and podcast guests are for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice. Podcast hosts and guests may maintain positions in the offerings discussed in this podcast. The intro song, Fishing for Pets, is written and composed by Alan Goldshire from his latest release, Live at the Lakeview Lounge. Hello, and thank you for joining me today on the Alts Podcast. Today we're talking data centers and information technology with Mark Thiele, the CEO of Edgevana. Edgevana provides and facilitates data center storage and hardware solutions to companies looking to create or establish stronger network connections. Mark is also a thought leader in the far-reaching technology space. Mark's career in information technology spans nearly 30 years, beginning as a technical solutions manager for Hewlett-Packard in 1993. He has some interesting thoughts on how technology has shaped our lives and where we are headed. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Mark. All right, guys, thank you for joining me on the podcast today. Today we have a very special guest. We have the CEO of Edgevana, Mark Thiele, and he is an expert in IT. So really looking forward to talking to him about everything IT. Thanks for being on the podcast, Mark.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to chat.
Absolutely. So when we're looking to have you on as a guest, I was like, where do we begin with IT? Because sometimes I have trouble just plugging in things into the wall. But it seems like you have so much so many different avenues that you can go into with IT. And I was wondering if you could just kind of give me some background, a general idea of what you do at Edgevana and how you're kind of working with companies in the blockchain.
Sure. Yeah, so you're right about IT. I mean, that could be an entire podcast in and of itself about the career opportunities and avenues for college grads, for non-college grads, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a fascinating conversation and a necessary one. As far as Edgevana is concerned, we were built under the pretext that demand for technology would exceed the locations and capacity of existing service providers. So existing service providers would be companies like Amazon in the cloud space, or Google and Microsoft in the cloud space. Equinix, many people are familiar with that name, even if they have only a passing knowledge of the IT space. Equinix provides colocation capacity in 250 data centers distributed around the world. Other companies in the same space would be companies like Digital Realty Trust and Sixtera and companies like that, Flexential. And we really felt at the beginning of the genesis of the Edgevana idea was that the demand coming from the requirement to bring more technology out to where the customer lives and works, right, would drive significant increase in demand for the kinds of services that an AWS might provide, an Amazon might provide, or an Equinix might provide normally, but also for distribution. And I'll talk a little bit about that really quickly without trying to bore everybody to tears. But edge computing, for instance, and Web3 are both linked. And Web3 is linked to blockchain and metaverse, et cetera, et cetera. And they have some inherent similarities in demand and technology strategy to support each of those areas. So if we lump that together and call it edge computing, edge is the idea basically of expanding back out the technology solutions that are available today that you use on your phone now, or that you use from your office or whatever, and creating applications, similar ones or new ones, that are right where the action is occurring, right? So for instance, some of the most common things that people talk about when they talk about edge computing is autonomous vehicles, right? So you can imagine, we're using really, really simple terms. You can imagine if your car is driving and making decisions, that you wouldn't want to wait even half a second for it to go find information, right?
Yeah.
Network traffic from one location to another can add anywhere from a quarter of a second to several seconds to a transaction. So edge computing is really meant to help bring the compute infrastructure closer to where the activity is occurring, closer to where the car is driving, closer to where you're using retail services, closer to where you're experiencing an event, so that you don't have any delay. Your vehicle, machinery, and a factory floor don't have any delay in how the applications respond to them, right? And so that's edge computing. How that relates to Web3 and Edgevana is that Web3 has a lot of the same demands as edge computing. They need global distribution. They need availability, like a traditional application in a data center needs, meaning it needs to be available most of the time. You can't just say, oh, I was using Amazon to do my business yesterday, but today it's down. Oh, well, you can't do that. It needs to be available to you, right? And so Web3 has that global distribution, in some cases, requirement to be close to where activity is occurring via either an individual or an application. There are data residency issues, especially in Edge, Web3 in general, and metaverse. There are data residency profile information, like when you log into Instagram or Facebook or eBay, you have a profile that identifies who you are, what you like, what you clicked on last time, et cetera, et cetera. Every application, almost every application, has something similar. Having that profile information readily available to you with fast response is part and parcel with being able to have a better experience and to be able to use more applications that have more in-depth experiences, more engaging experiences for the user of the application. And that's really required for Edge, or one of the things that Edge is supposed to help solve for. And Web3 and the metaverse all benefit from that capability as well. And so Edgevana was really created with the idea of making it easier for enterprises and Web3 companies to get to the places that they needed to go, to be able to find the data centers, the physical buildings, find the networks, find the compute infrastructure that they needed to be able to deploy their applications or their services wherever they needed to be around the world.
So, and I'm trying to imagine how this works. So at the backbone, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, Mark, at the backbone are these data centers, right? That are kind of helping these networks run.
Yep.
And then they're running through the cloud. I would imagine.
Well, some applications are, some aren't, right?
Yep. Yeah. I kind of want to take a little step back, if we are, if at all, if we could talk about these data centers, like how much of that edge is required for a company like Amazon, and what do these data centers look like? What do they store? How many? What kind of computers are in there?
Right.
All these things that come to my mind. Can you give me some insight into that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, you're probably going to get too much insight, so I apologize up front to you and to the audience. But no, at its core, a data center it's like a big computer. Mm-hmm. When you really dumb it down, a data center is a big building that has a significant amount of security. It has some automation associated with it relative to security and relative to the ability to provide conditioned air. Because they are generally speaking, they're very climate controlled in order to maintain temperatures and humidity and stuff for the computer equipment that resides in the data centers. The data centers are designed to a high degree of availability, meaning, they're oftentimes, if they're in earthquake country, they're designed around the idea of surviving even relatively bad earthquakes. They're designed to survive floods and tornadoes and things like that, because the things that we do all day long on our phones, on the laptop that I'm looking at you through right now, on the computers that help a company stay in business or sell products, those things need to be maintained and they need to be able to stay available. And that's what a data center was designed around. And the reason I call it basically like a big computer is that if you were to take one server out of the data center, but let's say it's still plugged in and still running, but you were to go mess with one, when you open the case, it would set off an alarm. Hey, somebody's breaking into this computer. You open the door to the data center, same thing occurs, right? When water gets on the case, oh, hey, there's moisture. We should do something, send an alert, whatever. If the temperature gets too high, we should warn somebody or shut down the equipment so it doesn't get destroyed, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things are mirrored in the larger design of the building that supports that equipment. And the equipment that you might find in a data center, just like the design of a data center itself, can vary immensely. I mean, I've been in some data centers where there are racks and racks of iPads, just, Apple iPads in little slots. And I've been in other data centers where there are rows and rows of incredibly dense, high performance computing with Intel or NVIDIA chips or AMD chips in them, creating an incredible or using an incredible amount of power and running major applications for companies around the world. Large storage devices, like everyone has a storage device in their computer, in their phone. In one rack in a data center, there might be as much storage as there is in 1,000 cell phones.
Wow.
Right? So all of that equipment is maintained. It's very expensive, and it's oftentimes performing work that is critical to whoever it's performing the work for.
So you're versed in the technical aspects of the data center. I'm wondering if you're also, if you could talk a little bit about choosing a data center, right? The business behind the data centers.
Sure.
Because we did do some writing and we talked about, alternative real estate.
Yep.
And we've found that there's this thesis that as we become more digitized, as this Web3 becomes more prominent, as more people are working from home,
yep.
That data centers are only going to, increase in the coming years. The space needed is going to increase. Could you talk about that trend as well?
Yeah. And so, going back to your original question about starting Edgevana, is part and parcel with why we founded Edgevana. Was we believed that the demand would increase and outstrip the ability for some of the easily accessible capacity to support it, right? And so there would be a lot more building that would go on, but a part of it is also how do we more effectively use, from a sustainability standpoint, from a barrier to entry standpoint, how do we more effectively use some of the resources that are already available but just aren't mainstream or aren't easily accessible, like an AWS data center or an Equinix data center might be. And so all of the trends you mentioned, as well as just the ongoing assumption that the more we modernize and the cheaper we make each function of compute or an application to be, the more things people will discover they want to use technology to solve for. Right? So to give you a simple example, I showed an iPhone earlier. Show it again. If you and I were having this conversation in 2004, and I said, guess what? I have inside information that Apple's going to release a new phone. It's going to be touchscreen, and eventually it's going to have 2 million applications available to it. 2 million. Now, I can't even comprehend using 2 million applications today, 27 years later. Imagine trying anybody that was using a BlackBerry would have been excited to have 40 applications available to them.
Yeah, very true.
Right? Or a Palm Pilot or something like that. So you would have laughed at me, or I would have laughed at you if we'd have said there's going to be 2 million applications on the phone. Do you know why there's 2 million applications on the phone? Because the barrier to entry for deploying those applications is really low, right? So think about when Oracle or SAP first had to create an application that would go into an enterprise. They had to find clients that were willing to spend millions of dollars each time that they bought. And that economic assumption was what drove their investment decisions into building the applications that became Oracle and SAP and anything else that you might use.
Hmm.
Now, fast forward to the age of the iPhone. Now, you and I just happen to be coders we code shit on the weekends. And we spend a couple of days thinking, hey, there's this, the museums have this great opportunity to give people a better experience. So let's create an app that people can put on their phone when they go visit the Louvre or when they visit the Smithsonian, and that app can help them get a better experience in the museum. Well, you and I could code that application just our own time. We could deploy it on here. We could charge $1.99 for it, or even 99 cents for it. It has a billion people that might look at your application. So our little investment, we only need, a few thousand to download it to justify the time and effort we put in. And so that's what I'm really talking about, the barrier to entry. When you create a big enough audience in combination with the ability to lower prices for introducing technology, you dramatically increase the amount of technology that gets adopted.
Yeah,
and so this is my long-winded answer to your question about data centers, is that fundamentally, we're not going to be able to build data centers fast enough until we have a massive sea change in how technology is delivered. Is that quantum computing? Is that where we can get the computational capacity of the latest AMD EPYC chip on a piece of rice? I don't know what it is. But historically, every time we make a major advance, all it does is create more consumption.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah. So it creates a greater demand, huh? And
yeah,
it's almost like we don't know how much technology we're capable of consuming until we're exposed to the next round of it, And then,
well, think about it, right? I mean, if you had to invent turning on your car from your key inside the house on your own, just for your car, it never would have happened.
right.
It never would have happened.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have happened for me. It wouldn't have happened for you. It wouldn't have happened for any of the people in technology that I know. On the other hand, if I'm putting that technology in a key and I can sell that key and that car to 1 million people, the investment makes sense. To do something as stupid as being able to start your car before you get into it, or have the windows rolled down a little bit because the Vegas summers are so hot, it'll be nice to let the air out before you get in. Those kinds of things, those are just dumb technology things that we can do now because of the economics of technology use, where if you were trying to solve for that in 1965 in a Buick, it would have cost you so much money as to never be justifiable. So it's those kinds of things and millions more that we can't anticipate that are just waiting to be discovered when the prices and capabilities improve.
Absolutely. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about those, emerging technologies, if you can, what are the next discoveries? I mean, maybe this could lead us into a discussion about Web3. It could lead us into a discussion about, the metaverse. And you yourself have said that you're kind of pivoting in that direction. Edgevana is pivoting toward Web3. What does that look like for a company? What does that mean for a company? And how do you plan on leveraging that?
Yeah. So for me, pivoting to Web3, I'll start with the kind of the last question first. For me, pivoting Edgevana to Web3 is a business decision about what kind of customer we want to chase, right? As opposed to what kind of design our company executes against. As in, I'm not Walmart changing from being a box store to being an all online store, or even Walmart changing from being a Web 2 company to being a Web 3 company. My internal requirements for Web 3 are almost non-existent because I'm such a small organization at this point. But where we decided to pivot because we saw the growth opportunity in this space. And frankly, I didn't want to look back 5 years from now and go, damn it, I really wish I'd bought that Amazon stock in 1998. Mm-hmm. I really wish that I'd been a part of building the Google search engine in 1999, because that's likely that the amount of change we're likely to see because of Web3, the metaverse, edge computing, et cetera, over the next 5 to 10 years will exceed what we saw between 1995 and 2005 relative to the rest of the internet.
Wow.
And when you consider how big that was and how big it continues to be, that's a very bold statement from me, right? But that's really what I believe. And so that's why we pivoted, because we started getting customer interest from the Web3 community. And we felt like we could solve for Web3 problems from an Edgevana perspective without sacrificing the work we did to solve for Web2 companies that need distributed applications and infrastructure. In fact, our methodology for building to support Web2 companies by accident was a perfect match to Web3, because a lot of detail, I won't go into all of it, but Web3 in most cases are, there's one word that companies in the Web3 space hate. One word: centralization. They don't like to be accused of it. They want to try to get away from it as much as possible, right? And so centralization means I run a bunch of computers and they're all in one place, or one company's places, right? That's centralization, simply put. What they would prefer, and this is where we brought value to Web3 companies, is that by virtue of how we built Edgevana, we could deploy infrastructure for them. And the way we deployed automatically put infrastructure in a diverse set of suppliers. So they, by virtue of how we deployed, they got the decentralization that they wanted, right? So that's why Edgevana ended up being, at least the way I see it and what I believe, to be a great fit for Web3 companies. Now, as far as what enterprises should expect or should think about relative to those things, and again, any one of the topics you've brought on so far could have been a whole podcast all by itself, right? So I'll try to shrink it down. From a Web3 standpoint, simply put, if as a mid-sized company or larger, if you don't have a Web3, meaning a metaverse presence, 5 years from now, you'll be like a mid-sized company in the year 2000 that didn't have an internet presence.
Wow.
And you know what that means? You're invisible.
You're out of business. Yep.
Right. And I'm being 100% serious about that. Right. And you don't have to take my word for it.
Can you, Mark? Can you define? I mean, let's talk about that a little bit, because there's so many definitions for it. I get that. But what does that mean? Like, how can you go beyond? Does that mean some sort of augmented reality where I'm shopping in a virtual reality Walmart now, or is it nothing like that? Is it more simply where you're interacting still on your phone, but you have you are a participant now somehow in that Walmart?
It's really all of the above, right? I mean, think about how most of our applications look on a website, and then think about an email or a phone, right? Phone, of course, nobody likes a phone, because the problem with a phone is that it's dependent on reaching someone. And it's dependent on how fast that person can convey an answer to you. Yeah. So one, you have to wait to get to the person. And then two, you have to hope the person can actually give you the answer you want. And that if they transfer you, they actually transfer the story you just gave them to the next person, so you don't have to do it over again. This is why a website is so valuable, right? That's a very, very simple reason why a website is so valuable. But a website is, I can go like this, but I can't reach into it. I can't do anything inside the website. I can't tell if the breeze outside your house is cool or warm. I can't tell if you're playing music quietly in the background, or if you're taking notes on what Mark said and making fun of him. I can't experience that. What a metaverse potentially provides to a buyer is that I could go online in the store. If I wanted to be, I could be in the store. I could go into a room and I could try on every outfit in the entire store without ever taking my shoes off. Mm-hmm. Right? All in the dressing room or the VR room, whatever the case may be. I could go to an event. I'm a geek, so a lot of the events I go to are geek events. They're data center or Web3 events or whatever, right? So I could go to an event and I could be looking for Stefan, and I see, based on the fact that I know Stefan, oh, there's his avatar at the other end of the hallway in this imaginary space. And as I walk over to you, I see that you're talking to Kate. And I can tell it's Kate. And as I get closer, the closer I get, the more I start actually hearing your conversation with Kate.
Okay.
As if I'm walking up to you in person, right? And then when I see you and when we virtually shake hands and say hello, we say, let's go check out room C12. I hear there's an interesting talk going on in there. Oh, and by the way, Akash is in there, I think, already. So let's see if we can find him. As we get closer to that room, we start hearing the clapping of the people clapping for the speaker in the room. And as we open the virtual door, we see the speaker in front of the stage, and the stage is showing the slides or video or whatever it is that the speaker is talking about. And then we hear the chatter in the room, and we can see Akash, and he pulls us over and we sit down next to him. In other words, long story short, we're literally experiencing the activity. We can even exchange goods via things like NFTs, etc., all within the metaverse. Now, imagine you have something even simple like what I'm describing, and you're in competition with a similar company right next door to you that just has pictures on a website. Which one do you want to be?
Yeah.
No question. There's really no question, right? The metaverse is perceived as very dystopian, and certainly it could be. There's no doubt. Just like we have regular social media today, and a lot of the social media we have today, I'm not going to pick on any companies here, could be considered very dystopian in the problems that they raise. But really what this is, in my mind, it's not a replacement for your kids to go outside and kick the ball on the street. But it is an alternative when your kid wants to spend time with grandma, and he can literally go sit in grandma's backyard with her, even though she's in Germany.
Yeah.
And talk to her and exchange things and experience the birds and the bees flying around in the backyard, et cetera, as if he's there.
Yeah.
These are exactly very powerful, engaging experience that create memories and a lasting effect on the people. When was the last time you went to a website that had a lasting effect on you?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, where you can experience something where, like you said, where you could feel something. I mean, there's really nothing like that right now, right? I mean,
right. I mean, some of us you've probably seen some of those commercials where Cox has the thing you put on your body and it acts like the two people are hugging. They feel like they're hugging. I mean, that's kind of a taste of what this environment will eventually bring to people as far as creating experiences and memories.
That's great. That's awesome. And just kind of, whatever, I get lost in some of those images sometimes, but kind of taking it back a little bit more, you talk about decentralized, right? Yep. And I wrote in some of the questions in preparation, we're talking about nodes. Mm-hmm. And kind of how the nodes are kind of like the backbone of these blockchains, a lot of these blockchains. Right. And they are, they are decentralized. Bitcoin miners, the Bitcoin node miners, they're spread all over the world. Right. And that's kind of the thing. Like, you can't hack into the Bitcoin network. Is that kind of what we're talking about when you're talking about that companies, want to have their data, their storage, stored in different places and different networks because of security?
Well, it's a component and an opportunity in the blockchain space, right? Is to be able to create transactions and ledgers that are distributed entirely fault tolerant and not changeable by a third party, right? So that's a big part of it. In some cases, you could create complex database environments with distributed infrastructure and support them in a way that gives you most of the same thing. But there are serious limitations on the amount of complexity you can introduce, the cost of supporting it in multiple locations as a unique pile of infrastructure, the speed of the transactions, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, some of these blockchains, some of the ones that I'm working with, have transaction performance that exceeds the transactions that occur on the MasterCard and Visa networks.
Wow.
So imagine how many people are putting Visa cards in, every second of every day, right? And they can actually perform more transactions in the same amount of time. What the node, and we've taken to calling them node operators because there are different names depending on what is being supported for that blockchain. Mm-hmm. Like if they're supporting staking versus proof of work versus storing of data, et cetera, they all have different names. But for this discussion, let's call them node operators. And effectively, what the node operators are is sort of a combination of disaggregated capacity and performance management, fault tolerance, and transparency, right? So when you build an application or service that runs over a blockchain, all those people that operate a node on that blockchain are helping to stamp those transactions that are occurring. Mm-hmm. And they get rewarded for doing that, right? The more performant, the more they do that, the more they get rewarded. And it's sort of a self-fulfilling process for supporting the success of the network, but also for helping the network grow, right? Yeah. So it is in theory, it's not perfect yet by any stretch. And I'm not sure any of the companies would tell you that it is perfect yet by any stretch. Maybe a couple of them would. But the real goal is to create incentives for people that use the network to accomplish work, like selling NFTs or doing authentication or doing financial transactions or whatever else they're doing, to find a value in using the network and paying for those transactions, and having that work effectively support somebody like you or me who has a computer in a data center somewhere and is staking on that network and effectively locking in those transactions on the blockchain. Yeah. Right. And so, and going back to the decentralized focus, again, a part of the story, a big part of the story associated with decentralization is this notion that over time, whether you're a musician trying to get closer to your customers and your fans, or you want to make financial transactions with somebody in Amsterdam or Lagos, Nigeria, that you're able to do those transactions on your own with 100% faith and 100% record management, all via the blockchain without having to worry about a middle person in between.
Yeah.
And that's in the long term, it's really that outcome that the decentralization is important to.
Yeah. A lot of that, when I think about making these transactions, these financial transactions, I'm thinking about the Bitcoin, I'm thinking about the Lightning Network, yep. where you could submit payments or whatever, micro payments even in a second, and it's already here. It's already here. So now it's almost like, how do you now take that kind of technology, right? And how do you apply it to other industries?
Right.
Whether it's sending, I don't know, let's use real estate. I don't know, whether it's sending, records, mortgages, whatever the case might be,
yep.
in an instant, right?
Right.
And I'm wondering if that's kind of at the heart of where we're headed, where we talk about, and we talk about NFTs and right now, the pictures and things like that, but really we haven't even touched the surface.
No, we're just scratching the surface, right? NFTs get a lot of noise because there are a lot of there's a lot of star power behind them, right? For lack of a different any other thing. In the long term, will NFTs still be important? Oh yeah, I'm certain they will. My daughter recently went to Coachella, and they had an NFT that popped open and offered you things, after you went into the concert, right? Things like that. So NFTs are coming. They're still new. Still, people are still trying to figure out the best way to bring value with them or get value from them, but they are happening. But to your other points, I'm sure if you spent 10 minutes with or without me on the call, thinking about how certain business transactions might occur more fluidly if at every point of the transaction there didn't have to be someone involved or some sort of delayed response involved. And my first inclination when I think about that is that anything that requires a lot of very small transactions, it sort of goes back to what we were talking about before about how the better technology gets and the cheaper it gets, the more things you figure out what to do with.
100%.
Well, if we can figure out how to take payment from people in seconds or microseconds for a service, right, then you can begin to justify creating services based on that knowledge, whereas you would never be able to create that service successfully if every time I did the transaction, I had to call you up and say, would you approve that 5-cent transaction that lasted for half a second?
Right.
That's kind of like when the IRS sends you a check that says you still owe us 13 cents. They just spent $100 creating a letter, putting it in the mail to send it to you to say you owe 13 cents. It doesn't make economic business sense, right? So It really, that area of opportunity is, I don't want to say uncharted, but unexploited at a minimum. A huge opportunity in so many different areas.
And to your point, that's kind of where you are. You see that opportunity. I mean, that's exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about this is where we're headed. Could you talk a little bit about who you work with, like who, maybe not names, but or anything like that, but kind of like what kind of companies you work with, you know, what problems they present, and if there's something even outside the scope of data centers, right? I mean, is there something that they're looking to somehow, you know, even make the data center become part of this, you know, kind of get rid of that physical aspect of it, if that's even possible?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have the perfect answer to the last part of the question, but to give you some sampling of the kind of customer requests that we're working on, we've had requests that are as simple in my parlance, simple, but they're not simple activities. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense for Edgevana to be in business. Yeah. But as simple as somebody saying, I need space in data centers in generally speaking, these two geographies. Can Edgevana go out and find me the data centers, put them under one contract, find me network, put that under the same contract, and then tell me when it's ready, right? Something as simple as that. So basically it's like, I found hotel rooms with internet service for somebody who's going to be traveling. Only it's millions of dollars worth of technology gear that's going to stay there for years under contract, right? But otherwise, very similar. That's kind of the more simple end. The more complex end of what we're doing for a customer is literally building them a globally distributed set of cloud infrastructure. So it's the data centers, the network, the people to support the environment, the servers, meaning the computers themselves, the storage devices, the network devices, all that kind of stuff, how they're packaged in order to provide the service to the end customer, how the customer gains access to that equipment and buys it and uses it, how the buyer of the original order from us visualizes the environment, all of that. So it's from the simple that I first mentioned all the way to this complex level of being able to deploy infrastructure for someone. And I tell you, I'm sometimes probably boring to people that aren't in the tech space, but this stuff, enabling companies to do business more effectively globally, is something I can eat all day long. Never get tired of it. It really is fun stuff.
Absolutely. I guess one more point, Mark, because I saw that it's been kind of in the news, and it's, I think, important to you from what I've gathered on your feeds and things like that. And I guess the environmental impact, right?
Yep.
That I've noticed. Where does that all fit in? That's my question. Like, how much of in the future, as we're developing these technologies, how careful do we as a society, as a government, need to be careful about the consumption?
Right. Right. And so I wish there was a magic answer.
Mm-hmm.
But, going back to part of my first answer about Edgevana, was that we felt that we could at least start reducing the potential impact on the environment by helping companies maximize the utilization. Companies that are our supply, but also companies that buy from that supply, helping them, both parties, maximize utilization of infrastructure that is oftentimes otherwise invisible to the buyer and not easily procurable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So because it's kind of like, what's the most efficient car, right? Let's say it's a Prius, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you have 6 people in your family. So if you have to drive the Prius to and from school twice every morning, is it more efficient than buying a Camry or buying a Suburban? Right?
Yeah.
I don't know. We'd have to do the math, but you get the idea,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so my goal, my focus, as part of my focus from Edgevana, is to maximize that utilization. So the more we use a service to closer to 100% of its real capacity, the better we are than anything new we could possibly buy, no matter how efficient it is.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's one aspect. The other aspect is something I did just recently with the iMasons organization. They are putting out what they're calling the climate accords from the technology industry. It doesn't necessarily have to be only the technology industry, but that's where it's being originated.
Yeah.
Many of the members of the iMasons organization and the companies that are involved are personal friends, people I know, people I've worked with over the years, people I've been to events with, people I've shared dinner with, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm deeply involved with them and vice versa. And their effort is to try to help identify and eventually measure and manage down the embedded carbon that's in all of the objects that we use. Computers, data centers, vehicles, paved roads, transformers in the data center, generators, air conditioning units. How do we establish a baseline for what carbon was created in making this object, right? From digging in the ground and pulling up the gravel that eventually becomes cement,
Mm-hmm.
how much energy was used by that truck, how much energy was used by the machines that crush the rock, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the embedded carbon that's in cement, as an example, right? So at every layer of opportunity, we'll eventually have the chance to measure what is in the items now and identify process and measures for reducing that over time. So just as important as it is to have a car that gets 30 miles to a gallon instead of 15 miles to a gallon, or gets an equivalent of 100 miles to a gallon on electricity versus 40 miles to a gallon in gas, just as it is important to do that, it's also important to say, well, what materials did we use to make that car?
Right.
And how did we make those materials? How did we ship those materials, et cetera, et cetera? So in many cars that don't get a lot of mileage by their owners, the embedded carbon in the car is probably worth more if you can save it than the savings they got going from 25 miles to a gallon to 35 miles to a gallon.
Gotcha.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot. Yeah, that makes sense for sure. And I guess tracking it is important, and having that information is important. And I guess the skeptic in me says, well, what does it matter if it doesn't make sense financially?
Well, that's going to always be a key, right?
Yeah.
And like the story of technology and the barriers to entry improving over time, allowing for more adoption. If you and I were having this discussion in 2006, it would have been easily arguable by you against me that, I don't want to use renewable energy. I don't want to do that because it's going to cost me more to get a kilowatt of solar power than it will to get a kilowatt of coal-fired power.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, it's all about my profit margin, right? Yeah. So if I can't make better profit or at least the same profit, then it's not worth it to my business, right? And unfortunately, a lot of people still think that way. But two things are happening. One is more and more people are taking it to heart that they do owe civilization, their communities, their families, a little bit better respect for how the world is treated. Mm-hmm. So they're focused on this more. And just that change of being focused on it more drives a lot of behavior, right? But secondarily to that, the more we focus energy on renewables and alternative building supplies, and the more interest there is in the community, the more buyers there are, the more buyers there are, the more scale there is. The more scale there is, the cheaper the products and services become.
Sure.
Right? And right now, there are, and I don't want to speak for those companies, but there are, at least just in the United States corporations, there are probably 200 or 300 major corporations right now that will not buy from you as far as a major service or, a data center service or something like that. They will not buy from you if you don't have a strategy for getting to net zero.
Wow.
Yeah. So the amount of change that's occurred in this space just in the last 3 years exceeds the change in that space in the previous 10.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. And I think that's a great way to kind of, cap our conversation. I mean, when we talk about that change, not just in the technology, but also kind of in the way we think about it, in the way we think about how it impacts us, not as a society, but environmentally.
Right. Right.
Mark, how can people learn more about Edgevana? Where are you active on social media where they can get more, about your thoughts, about what you're up to, if they want to reach out?
Well, I appreciate that. So Edgevana is easy enough to find, edgevana.com. Most of my blogs that don't end up on a technical news site will also be posted there. I also have a podcast, a technology-oriented podcast that you can reference there. Absolutely. And I often exchange technology discussions with folks on both LinkedIn, under my profile on LinkedIn, Mark Thiele, and under my Twitter handle, which is mthiele10. So MTHIELE10. And I'm fairly active on both. Being the CEO of a rapidly growing startup means I'm not as active as I used to be. But I love the exchange of ideas. And anybody that's known me for more than a couple of years on LinkedIn will know that I'm also I love challenging my own assumptions about what is or what will be happening. And I believe that debate is important to all of us. So I am always open to the assumption that I'm wrong.
Yeah. Well, in 5 years, we can find out if we can walk into that conference that you described earlier
yep.
today, and if we have a comparison to.
I'm telling you already can.
Yeah.
You already can. The only question is whether or not it'll be widely adopted.
Okay.
That's the real question, but you already can. In fact, if you're interested, a good friend of mine is the CEO of a company called Vatom Inc. Virtual Atom, VATOM Inc. And they build metaverse for companies. And some of the experiences that I just shared with you, were experiences I had in his metaverse software. So it's already here. Yeah, it's amazing.
Gonna check that out. Gonna definitely check that out, Mark. It's so great talking to you. Great talking to you. Thank you for giving us some insight on these data centers and just the adoption of technology, and how you brought up some really good points. And the one that's sticking out to me was, again, the more innovation, the more we're gonna consume, and kind of where that takes us. But thank you so much, Mark. Again, all the best.
Same to you. Appreciate you having me on. Thank you very much.
Have a great day.
You too.
This was definitely a wide-ranging talk with Mark about data centers, the need for companies to incorporate the metaverse in their business plans, and the effect of technology on consumption. The idea is that the more we integrate technology into our lives, the more that we, as a society, are going to consume. His description of the metaverse is powerful, especially the one describing how family members can be together even if there are thousands of miles between them. I'd like to thank Mark for joining the podcast and being such a great guest. And I'd like to thank you for spending part of your day with Alts. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast, let others know about it or leave a review or a comment. Until the next episode, take care.